Hello, my name is Olivia Gonzales. This is for my FCS 210 class at New Mexico State University. This class is about the development of infants and toddlers. My topic is prenatal cognitive development. Shout out to Ashley for letting me use her channel to upload this video. Hopefully there will be some good information in here for y'all. So when do babies begin to develop a brain? Well, brain development begins as early as 0 to 3 weeks old. As soon as a baby is conceived and implanted in the uterus, development speeds rapidly ahead, creating a person with unique talents and personality. And by the time the baby is born, the brain is already 25% of its adult weight. According to the Urban Child Institute, most of the structural features of the brain appear during the embryonic period, so you actually begin to see it more physically about the first 8 weeks after fertilization, even though it already starts to grow at 0 to 3 weeks old. And then it obviously continues to grow throughout the pregnancy. About 7 weeks after conception, the first neurons and synapses begin to develop in the spinal cord. These early neural connections allow the fetus to make its first movements, which can be detected by ultrasound and MRI, even though in most cases the mother cannot feel them because the baby is still too small. So these movements in turn provide the brain with sensory input that spurs on its development. So already the baby is learning by the movements that they make. And more coordinated movements develop over the next several weeks. So as the baby makes a movement that is helping the brain learn how to make those movements and how to refine them even more. When do other senses develop? Well, while the brain takes 0 to 3 weeks to develop, the other sensory organs begin functioning throughout the pregnancy, beginning in ectoderm. So the blastocyst, the fertilized egg that has already been implanted in the uterus, it has 3 parts: the endoderm, the ectoderm, and the mesoderm, and they all specialize in certain areas. So the ectoderm is responsible for the nervous system, and so that part of the blastocyst then grows out to help in the development of the nervous system, which obviously includes the brain, which is part of the central nervous system. And this is important because these sensory organs actually help develop the brain. It helps in cognitive development when the sense of touch um, comes by 8 weeks. By 13 weeks, there's a sense of taste. Babies prefer sweet over bitter. By 17 weeks, there's a sense of hearing. And after birth, they do recognize songs played during gestation, and we'll actually talk more about that in a little bit. By 25 weeks, the human fetus has eyes that close for sleep and open and move freely during periods of wakefulness. So all of these senses help the brain to start learning and actually aid cognitive development. There are some potential hazards to cognitive development, which we're going to go into next. First, I'd like to define a teratogen, which is any agent that can potentially cause a physical birth defect. So this will be important as we explore some things that could possibly hurt the development of the baby. So you can see in this image that there is basically a timeline of development. And at the very beginning, at 3 weeks, we see that the neural development begins to speed. You can actually see the brain in that image. It's also the time when there can be major abnormalities. So those two actually coincide with one another and go forward. So that's actually a really critical period. And in that time, there can be significant damage to the nervous system. So while it's kind of scary to think about because some people don't even know they're pregnant at 3 weeks. But hopefully, I mean, the majority of the time it doesn't happen, but it's good. It's good to know And then also to be aware once you do realize you're pregnant, what's developing at what time, and then hopefully to get everything checked out, make sure everything's okay. Because one of the things that could cause a disorder is alcohol. Um, Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder includes a cluster of abnormalities and problems that appear in the offspring of mothers who drink heavily during pregnancy. Believe it or not, this actually affects 2 to 5% of births in North America. Um, it's characterized by neurocognitive difficulties and learning problems. And again, it's scary to think about if you were consuming alcohol in the first 3 weeks of pregnancy, not realizing that you were pregnant. According to John Sandrock, abnormalities include facial deformities and defects of the limbs, face, and heart. Many are below average intelligence, with some having an intellectual disability in the future. Children with FASD have deficiencies in the brain pathways involved in working memory. What is working memory? Working memory is basically responsible for the part of short-term memory that is concerned with immediate conscious, perceptual, and linguistic processes. So essentially, they have a hard time staying present. Um, it's not that they can't remember long term or even short term, but their functioning in the present, their current functioning when, for example, having a conversation is limited. And that's one of the things that can come about through fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Not every woman who drinks during pregnancy will have a baby with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but the risk is there. Another possibility of something that could happen to delay cognitive development is microencephaly. That's being born with abnormally small brain, and it's a possible effect of radiation exposure. Or, for example, if a father was um, exposed to radiation, then their offspring could then have microcephaly of some sort. Primary microcephaly, which is when the brain itself is abnormally small, microencephaly, um, occurs when there's no stimulus for the vault to grow. It also occurs when the cranial sutures fuse prematurely, precluding brain growth. So sometimes the skull just fuses together, not leaving enough room for the brain to continue growing to its normal size. And a recent microencephaly occurrence, according to the CDC, was during the outbreak of the Zika virus in the United States, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, and mostly in Puerto Rico in the last couple of years. So if you follow the news, you might have seen something about that. Another thing that we don't really consider enough is that emotional health of the mother has an effect on cognitive development. Research shows that women with high levels of stress are at an increased risk for having a child with emotional or cognitive problems, attention hyperactivity disorder, and language delay. So these are all things that could come about if mom is continually stressed out. It's not healthy for the mother to have unusual levels of stress, and unfortunately, this could come about with many things revolving around the pregnancy itself. It could arise from uh, dietary limitations. It could arise from working too much. So just remember that minimal stress is best. There are some tests that people conduct, or nurses conduct, doctors conduct on newborns to make sure that they're healthy, their cognitive development is healthy. Physically, they do typically use what's called the APGAR scale, but we're going to talk about a couple that assess neurological development. The Brazelton Neonatal Assessment Scale occurs 24 to 36 hours after birth. It's a sensitive index of neurological competence, and they assess neurological development through reflexes and reactions to people and objects from the baby. A low score can indicate brain damage or stress to the brain that could potentially heal with time. It's not to say that the baby is doomed or whatever. The reflexes that are used for the test are sneezing, blinking, rooting, reaction to a rattle, and reactions to circumstances. So all of these things will help the doctor see if the brain has been learning movement properly, um, reaction to stimulus properly as well. And that gives us a clue as to the neurological development of the baby. Another one is the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit Network Neurobehavioral Scale. That's a mouthful. Um, the NICU has its own set of problems. Um, Typically, you have preterm and low birth weight babies in the NICU, and so you need a more comprehensive analysis of the newborn's behavior to hone in on anything that could possibly be delayed or going wrong with the health of the baby. Um, and so they assess the behavior, their neurological and stress responses, and they do that for the at-risk infants. And something that's interesting, we have a lot of technology that helps keep these at-risk babies alive, but at the same time, the rates of severe brain damage have also gone up. So survival rate goes up, also that brain damage as well. Very preterm low birth weight babies have abnormal axon development in their brains and have impaired cognitive development at 9 years of age. So they've actually gone a step further and tested it for the future. They are more likely to develop a learning disability, have ADHD, or an autism spectrum disorder. Also, they are prone to have breathing problems. So there are all sorts of complications that come with preemies. Believe it or not, 50% of all low birth weight children are enrolled in special education. So hopefully we continue to develop the technology to help improve or maybe find some kind of therapy to stimulate or advance that cognitive development for the future life of these children. Okay, so before we get into this slide, I want to recap just really quickly about what we've gone through so far. As the brain forms in the very beginning of life, the tools are being laid out to begin the lifelong process of learning. In the brain, there are many neurons made of axons and dendrites and synapses. These are like roads, neural pathways waiting to be connected. As the baby's senses also begin to work, the brain is learning as connections are being made by firing. An example could be that they begin to have an affinity for certain tastes, disliking bitter and liking sweet, which will eventually encourage breast milk intake. They also begin to feel their own movement and recognize their mother's voice, which occurs around 4 months as it reverberates throughout her body. Other voices to the baby might sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. They also hear her heartbeat. So all of these sensory inputs for the development of the brain and cognitive development. Babies learn in the womb. So this is actually, there's been a lot of interesting research in recent years on this. The sucking in headphones experiment, what I called it, proves that babies prefer their mother's voice. So it's hard to communicate with babies, newborns especially. One of the ways that we can kind of gauge what they're thinking is through their sucking. And so they did an experiment where the baby has headphones on, and there were two rubber nipples, and on one of them the baby was listening to their mother's voice, and then on the other one the baby was listening to a stranger, a woman's voice. And the baby quickly showed a preference for the first one, the first nipple that had their mother's voice. So that's one way that we know that they already prefer their mother's voice. Also, we know through their sucking, when they see they have a new stimulus, something that's interesting to them, they will suck rapidly. Whereas if they begin to get bored or something is routine, then the sucking is usually slow. There was an experiment done where mothers read their baby's Cat in the Hat in the last trimester every day, and it showed after they were born that babies were stimulated. They recognized and then quickly became bored of the Cat in the Hat because they recognized it, but then they had heard it so many times. so it was already routine. Um, so they heard the Cat in the Hat. And another funny one is another set of moms in their third trimester watch the same soap opera every day, and the babies actually recognize the soap opera's theme song. Um, so that was kind of funny. My baby might recognize Friends or something. Um, Another interesting experiment is that babies cry in the accent. Found that babies cry in the accent of their mother's native language. So, by recognizing the dialect of the mother, so for example, they said that German um, accent ends in a low note, and babies born to German mothers ended their cry in a low note, whereas in other parts of the world, the babies start on a low note and then go up into a high note, and so that mimics the accent of their mother. Um, there could be two reasons for this. Native language, crying in their mother's native language could be evidence for evolution. Babies cry in their mother's accent to gain more affection from them because mothers are most likely to be their primary care providers. But it could also just be the beginning of the process of learning language. And babies remember and prefer tastes of food swallowed through the amniotic fluid while in utero. So when mothers eat food, the food is basically diluted into the amniotic fluid, and babies essentially suck it up, and that's how they ingest it while they're in the womb. In this particular experiment, there was one where in the third trimester, mothers would primarily drink carrot juice, and then there was another control group where mothers primarily drank water. And then at 4 months after birth, they soaked some cereal in carrot juice, and then some just in water. And babies actually recognized it. Their facial expressions um, kind of imitated. Ooh, they thought it was yummy, the carrot juice. So they remembered and preferred that taste of the carrot juice from even when they were in utero, not having been exposed to it after they were born. There was another experiment that's kind of similar to this one done in Dijon, Paris. Um, basically, mothers in their third trimester would eat a lot of licorice. Some did, some didn't. And licorice actually is an anise flavor. So this one actually happens earlier than 4 months after birth. Actually, one day after birth, they exposed babies to this sort of anise flavor, and um, babies who had been previously exposed to that licorice taste, they enjoyed it, and babies who had never been exposed to that licorice taste basically thought yuck. They did the same thing again 4 days after birth, so showed the same thing 1 and 4 days after birth. So what we can assume from this is something really awesome, is that babies are learning something about their culture in the womb, and a big part of culture is food. So they're already learning about their cultural cuisine, the kinds of food that they will be eating after they come into the world, through the spices of the mother intake, the types of food that their mother eats. So they're already beginning to learn about that while they're in the womb. Now, this is my personal favorite. I think this is so interesting, that the diet of the mother and stress levels of the mother send the baby biological postcards, giving them hints about the kind of world they will be entering. So, what is just they did a couple of research studies on stress levels and diet. In 1944, that's the end of World War II. In Holland, there was what they called the starving winter, and a lot of people died in this winter. But there were also a lot of pregnant women during this winter. And in 1945, the they were liberated, and actually food became more plentiful at that time. And so while the baby was in utero, they were hungry. People were eating about only a fifth of what they were used to eating. And so their bodies were reacting as if, it's not getting enough food. People resorted to eating tulip buds, um, and it was not a good situation. But by the time the babies were born, they were born into a world where there was enough food. And so their bodies kind of already preset for that certain amount of food or that level of diet, thinking that that's the world, biologically that's the world they're going to be born into. And so many of those people actually in the future became obese or overweight. And that could actually point to the fact that when they were just beginning their development, their bodies already preset basically to a certain amount of food. And then to indicate stress levels, an experiment was done on people who were pregnant during 9/11. And babies who were born um, from people who were very close to 9/11, or just around that area at the time of the terrorist attack, it shows that in the future they've actually gained more anxiety, have anxiety disorders. And so this shows that, well, they have a raised level of that coping even in their blood. And so that can be indicative of the fact that when they were in their mother's womb, they received that signal from her as she was stressed out. And so they were able to adjust accordingly within their body, their biology, to be able to survive in that kind of stressful environment. So babies are able to detect, will they be entering a world of war, of scarcity, of plenty, just based on their mother's biology, what's in their blood, what they're eating, what they're being exposed to. Well, it turns out babies are a lot smarter than we think even before the moment they are born. Though many things can influence their cognitive development from conception, they are being influenced and woven together to be a unique individual. So I hope this was informative and that you learned a lot. And I don't know, I'm excited to see the research that comes out in the future, the research that uh, gives us more insight into what happens in the womb. Um, it's a really just amazing, the process of life. And those are my references. Thank you.